Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 4th through 6th Sundays of Easter. We have a couple content notifications for you for this episode. In our conversation about the first reading for the 4th Sunday of Easter, we do talk about the pandemic. We also mentioned the pandemic in our conversation about our first reading for the 5th Sunday of Easter. If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com, and you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Also, if you appreciate what we do, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch. Not only do you get access to special content, but you'll also be helping us be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us, since not everybody has a quick quotes quill to meet their accessibility needs.
The first Sunday that we'll cover in this episode is the 4th Sunday of Easter, which this year falls on May 3rd. The first reading is Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. The life of the early church is described as members abandon greed and class disparity for equity and the abolishment of poverty. So one of the themes in this passage is the holding things in common, this idea of sharing all of resources, pooling resources for whatever needs might arrive, which seems very much like the Hufflepuff common room ethos to me.
I think that's a lovely comparison.
I thought you might. Wrote that and was like, oh, he's gonna smile so big.
So yes, I would say it is like the Hufflepuff common room ethos. I would say, however, that it's not exactly the same as, say, everybody holding on to a portkey. Like, that is holding things in common, but no, we mean this in a slightly different sense.
That's hilarious. Everybody in the early church just walking around holding on to a mangy old boot.
I mean, Paul suggested some interesting things, more than suggested, but I don't think that would have been one of them, no.
Probably not, yeah. And then in verse 42, when we hear that the community devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, it reminded me of the first Harry Potter book when Harry's gotten in so much trouble for meddling, lost 50 points for Gryffindor, and gotten detention, and so he's like, I'm done meddling, and he actually does pretty well at it, devoting himself to studying for the finals and to classwork and to not meddling. It kind of works until the finals are over.
Yeah, kind of.
Kind of, sort of. It's the Harry Potter books. It's never going to work all that well.
True. Also, 5 points to Gryffindor for restraining yourself and not immediately making a Lord of the Rings reference the moment you saw the word fellowship. I'm very proud.
You're welcome.
When we reach verse 44, we read, all who believed were together. And I think this is a lovely example of how we read the Bible differently in different circumstances, not just differently as different people, but also when we're in different places in our lives, we read it differently. Because my first reaction to this was, hey, look who wasn't in a pandemic. Which is, as far as we know, the early church wasn't created in a pandemic, which, man, that would have been a mess.
That would have been hard.
Yeah, and that immediately made me think of, can you imagine what a giant mess the Ministry of Magic would have made of a pandemic? A magical pandemic has to be a whole different level of trouble because magical ailments seem to be just truly bizarre in ways we can't imagine. But
right, if everybody had spattergroit like Ron pretends to have.
Yes, or they all are suddenly hiccuping duck sounds instead of, I don't know, but there are all kinds of just wacky stuff.
I want to hiccup duck sounds. That'd be awesome. I almost do anyway, so probably wouldn't be that different.
But yeah, I cannot imagine the ministry, any version of the ministry, dealing with a pandemic. Oh, and now I have the lovely mental image of Hermione as Minister of Magic dealing with a pandemic and just yelling at people to
right, but
not be.
Hermione would do it well.
She would, but there would be a lot of yelling.
I don't know. I think she gets to the point where she understands the compassion part and she could be as good as the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
No, I would.
She's been rocking
yes,
it.
She's
or
great.
She will be basically Elizabeth Warren,
but younger. And with more interesting hair.
Mm-hmm.
But I totally believe that Hermione would be very good at it and would not be yelling initially, but I think we've noticed that Hermione has a point where she just breaks and would start yelling. And having seen how some people are reacting to this pandemic, not only in the US, but specifically in Britain where she would be, I have to imagine that she would get to the point of yelling eventually.
Maybe. I don't know. I think if things were handled differently in the UK, people would have responded differently, but they were not handled particularly well.
Okay, she totally gets to yell at the Prime Minister.
New Zealand. Oh, for sure. Prime Minister, especially if it were Boris Johnson. That would be like the end of it. Yeah.
But only if we get to record it, because that would be epic.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
Look, we have to find humor in this situation somewhere.
It's true, and we are. As we continue on, verse 45, it talks about the community would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds as any had need. Reminded me of Deathly Hallows, and it took me like forever to find this because I had to use my Kindle because my books are inaccessible right now. So I'm like using my Kindle version to like page through. But I finally found it. In Deathly Hallows, we know that part of what makes Harry realize that Hermione and Ron are serious about it is what they've done preparation-wise with their families.
Yeah.
So Hermione sending her folks to Australia and erasing their memories. Ron setting up this spatter-great ghoul in the attic. But the part that I was thinking about was the money, because they have to have money. And so Hermione mentions when they're at the coffee shop at Tottenham Court Road that she took out all her building society savings before she came to the borough. So she really did sell all that she had for the sake of the group and their mission and plan.
Yes. And for a moment of Brit speak interpretation, I believe that a building society in the UK is pretty similar to a credit union in the US. It's an organization that provides monetary services and builds things with your money and gives you interest on them.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and then in verse 45, related to the idea of abandoning greed and class disparity, I immediately heard that and imagined, what if instead of buying brooms only for the Slytherin team when Draco got onto the Quidditch team, what if instead Lucius had bought brooms for all of the teams so that they could all compete on equal footing? Like, imagine if Harry didn't get by with being the person on the best broom on the field at any given moment.
What? You mean
Actually
having a
having to have skill?
monetary advantage
I mean, he did
in
have skill,
equipment?
but still.
What? Yeah, but he had a faster broom than everyone else, and that mattered.
Yeah. Also, I don't know how private schools work, or, like, in Britain, I guess Hogwarts would be a public school because they have a different system for how they term things. But in public schools, if you're playing a school sport, you're all using the same equipment. Like, your school provides it so the other team might have different equipment, but you're not... You don't get to, like, wear special football pads that you bought for yourself, as far as I'm aware, that protect you better than everyone else's do.
Yeah, although in, like, intramural sports in college, we had to provide...
Sure, there was no funding for that, and I kind of got the feeling that Hogwarts did not have money problems.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but that is the impression I've gotten, too.
Our second reading for this Sunday is from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 19 through 25. The author discusses unjust suffering and Jesus' response to it.
So in the conversation about suffering, unjust suffering, the author talks about being aware of God in your suffering and in the whole, like, reasons why you're suffering type thing. Mm-hmm. Which could also be framed as, like, requiring consent. That, like, you have decided that this is a thing worth suffering for. Which means that Harry's suffering at the hand of Umbridge does not count because he is a minor and legally cannot consent to anything.
In the Muggle world. I mean, again, magical law seems to be pretty weird.
Yeah, but he's still a minor there.
Right, but we don't know if the magical world in Britain actually has that rule. Like, the Muggle world in the US does.
I think my point still stands because the way the centaurs talk about them, yes. They talk about them as... Well, no, but I think in general, like, the way the centaurs talk about Hermione and Harry is as innocents.
True.
So they're still, like, categorized in that way in the magical world.
Yeah, that's fair.
But what would count as this type of suffering and awareness of a larger purpose and stuff would be, like, Remus when he's going to be with the werewolves and definitely experiences suffering from being with the werewolves and from clearly being a werewolf who has tried to live among non-werewolves.
Yeah.
And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 20, the author says, "But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval." Which does, again, feel like Harry's perspective about Umbridge, that he feels like he is doing right and suffering for it. But as I just mentioned, he's a minor, so doesn't really count. There's no consent there. He's not an adult and able to do it. But then I was thinking about Sirius, right? Sirius did what was right. He did not betray his friends. He went to confront Pettigrew, and he is suffering for it.
Yeah.
Like, that is a textbook example of suffering, but for a higher purpose, and being willing to suffer because there is something else at stake.
Yeah. Or, while we're talking about the Black family, Regulus.
I thought of Regulus. I think 1 Peter is like all about suffering.
Yes.
I think I mentioned Regulus in the next Sunday's thing. Yeah, because he was the next one that I came up with.
Excellent. We don't forget about Regulus mostly because I keep insisting, but
I don't forget about Regulus
I know
either.
you don't.
I
but
like him.
It just seems like the Harry Potter community doesn't talk about him as much as... I mean, he only shows up for a couple minutes, but it's one heck of a couple minutes.
Yeah, and like this great redemption arc.
Yeah.
He deserves more media.
Yeah. In verse 23, we hear the author say, Jesus has entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And as Harry found out repeatedly, people do not always judge justly. We have several different examples, but Mrs. Weasley believing the rumors about Hermione was one that came to mind. And, of course, there are the actual trials where there were, real-life judges that were not just in the books, and several other examples.
And even when Harry does get away with stuff, right? When he blows up his aunt.
Yeah, that's not fair either.
That's not just either. Like, he just gets away with it.
Yeah.
No problem.
Haven't all of us wanted to blow up an aunt or two in our time?
Mm-hmm. In verse 25, we hear, "For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls." When I read this, I was thinking about... I was struck a couple different times, actually, in these readings, about the way that this sounds like Voldemort. Like, this sounds like Voldemort's perspective on purebloods who aren't Death Eaters, or at least sympathizers, right? Like, when he's like, Neville, you've just gone astray, come back to our side.
Yeah. Or,
what I think it's really like is when Regulus Black turns from being a Death Eater and goes and tries to destroy Horcruxes. That's his turning point, where he's like, oh, I've gone astray real bad. Maybe I should turn around and find that shepherd again.
Yeah, that's a good example. See, whereas I read that verse and I immediately just rephrased it in my head to, "For you were going astray like first years getting lost on the moving staircases." Not
also
all of
accurate.
Our references have to be, depressing and deathly and all that. So
yeah, no, that's just where I'm at right now.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is John chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Jesus describes himself and his relationship with us with a sheepfold-related metaphor. So the thing that stuck out to me here, and one of the references I frequently make when talking about biblical literalism, is this is the perfect example for where biblical literalism fails. Like, anyone who says they take the Bible literally then has to reckon with Jesus is a gate. How do humans become gates, get turned into gates? And who are the sheep? Metaphors for the win.
Listen, I am totally with you, Emily, but I have to admit that most of the people who claim to take the Bible literally leave room for, metaphor and poetry, and so on.
Then it's not literal.
Yes, I've tried having that argument.
Literal.
You never actually get anywhere.
Oh,
Spoiler
I'm not
alert.
actually interested in arguing with them.
Okay.
I'm just interested in poking fun at their...
Well, by argument, I meant philosophical argument.
Yeah, no. I'm not interested in that either.
Okay.
I'm not going to change their minds. They're not going to change my minds. I just want to poke fun at the holes in their claims. So, metaphors for the win. Just like Gryffindors aren't actually lions and Hufflepuffs aren't actually badgers.
No, we're honey badgers. It would explain a lot, I'm just saying.
Or honey badgers. Oh my gosh. Speaking of sheep and animals, in verse 2 and 3, we hear that the shepherd of the sheep comes and the gatekeeper opens the gate for the shepherd, and the sheep hear the shepherd's voice. So there's this sense of knowing a voice that is trustworthy, and the ways that the voice that is most clearly has that effect, I think, is Fox's Phoenix song. That gives courage and gives trust and strength to Harry. I mean, if we were reading the books from Tom Riddle's perspective, for sure, in the Chamber of Secrets, Tom Riddle does not have the same response to Fox's Phoenix song. But for all of the students and for the community at Hogwarts, Fox's Phoenix song is trustworthy and true.
When we reach verse 3, sounds like a shepherd very much has a similar job to a prefect handling first years. I have to admit that normally when I think of a prefect shepherding first years, I usually think of the first years as being like ducklings following them along. But I also like the image of a prefect like running around and herding first years as though they're sheep.
Yeah, I was going to say sheep might be like a better thing. Based on...
The first years tend to wander off.
Yeah.
This does explain why being careful who you choose as a prefect is such an important thing.
Yes, for sure. In verse 5, we get that the sheep will not follow a stranger, but they will run from the stranger because they do not know the voice of strangers. The other time a voice is really prominent to me in the books is the Horcrux. Both of those are connected to Horcruxes, but the locket Horcrux in particular, and the ways that it subliminally, like, kind of whispers to Ron, but then when they finally figure out how to open it, and Ron has the sword of Gryffindor, and Harry opens it, and then there is that voice of the locket trying to get Ron not to kill it, but to, like, kill Harry instead, and it takes a bit, but ultimately Ron does run from the voice, by which we mean stabbing the locket with Gryffindor's sword.
Yes, and that was a contextually appropriate response. Stabbing something with a sword is not necessarily always the contextually appropriate response. Like, we are not here to necessarily encourage people to stab things.
Yeah, no, only Horcruxes.
Sure.
And only if it's imbued with basilisk venom. It wouldn't have done anything if the sword wasn't imbued with basilisk venom.
Yeah. So I read that verse, and I thought of the fat lady denying Sirius's entrance into the Gryffindor common room, and he did slash the painting with some kind of a sharp object. But the fat lady denying Sirius entrance into the Gryffindor tower, that also definitely was something I thought of when I read of they will not follow a stranger, they will run from the stranger. Because clearly the fat lady ran from Sirius, too, eventually.
Yeah. And in that case, Sirius's response of trying to slash at the painting was not an appropriate response.
Yes, that is true. Yes. Again, stabbing things is not always the right answer, and it clearly didn't do Sirius any good.
Yep.
Our next Sunday for this episode is the 5th Sunday of the season of Easter, which this year falls on the 10th of May. And our first reading is from Acts chapter 7, verses 55 through 60. Stephen, who had been chosen by the early church for leadership as a deacon, shares a vision given to him by the Holy Spirit, and is stoned to death, becoming the first Christian martyr.
So one of the things that happens in this passage is foreshadowing. In this passage, the crowd makes clear the prominence of this person named Saul, who later on in Acts will be converted into Christianity and not be a persecutor of the church anymore. But so Saul's presence in this passage is like foreshadowing that like something's going to happen with this person who's specifically named in this way.
Yeah.
And that reminded me of Sirius in the first book, Sirius lending his bike to Hagrid, and the ways that both Sirius and the bike come back to have prominent roles later in this series.
Yes.
More foreshadowing. J.K. Rowling actually had a lot of foreshadowing and of like planting things at the beginning, like the Deluminator that'll come back.
Yeah. I kind of maybe wonder if the Deluminator was sort of accidental. Like, she wasn't thinking that this will later on be a thing that Ron will receive from Dumbledore and serve this particular purpose, but rather she expected Dumbledore would be able to do that at the start, and then several years later, while writing the last book, said, "Ooh, hey, what if I did a callback?"
Yeah, I don't know.
It still counts. It still works, but you know.
Yeah, it is hard to know like how much of it she had, because she had like the overall arc of the story, but like how many of the details Did she know that Ron was going to ditch them at some point, or hard to know? And then in verse 57, Stephen is telling of this vision that the Holy Spirit has given him, and the crowd covers their ears, and with a loud shout, all rush together against him. And I was like, well, it's not like Stephen was repotting mandrakes, people.
And now I have a lovely mental image of the crowd running forward to stone Stephen to death, all wearing fluffy earmuffs. So that's pretty fantastic, I have to say.
You're welcome.
In verse 58, we hear that the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. And as Emily explained a moment ago, we are going to run into Saul again later, and he will be converting to Christianity and presumably regretting these actions of watching people stone each other to death.
Not even presumably, he owns that.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, I'm a little confused on whether does he regret watching people get stoned to death because they're Christian, or is he, against stoning people to death in general after he converts? Because he is in favor of all sorts of interesting things that we would disapprove of after he converts. So
True.
That's a whole separate thing.
Unclear, yeah.
But still, like Snape, Saul would not change his ways in response to witnessing people being killed. Snape saw people getting killed before he changed his ways, and that was not the reason why he changed. He changed because someone he cared about was killed. Saul will eventually change because God gives him a vision and blinds him for a little while, and, hits him over the head with a proverbial clue-by-4, as you might say. But, yeah, I think that's an interesting thing for them to have in common, that they both watched people die and didn't change their ways because of it.
Yeah, which is interesting particularly right now.
Yeah.
Because we are seeing people die at alarming rates because of the pandemic. There are so many people who just, it's not hitting them. It's not sinking in just what this could mean for them or for their loved ones. And it's hard because it has to sink in. People have to get it in order to protect from it and to keep it from happening.
Yeah. And then in verse 59, we hear, while they were stoning Stephen. So in the movie Dogma, which is not G-rated, just to warn you, there is a bit where Chris Rock's character rephrased, "So you were martyred," into, "Well, I was bludgeoned to death by huge rocks." It's kind of a shame that Moaning Myrtle didn't get to have a moment like that, I think, in the books. She died for a fairly pointless reason. She died as a young child. She's not really given the incredible weight that deserves because she's made into this ongoing joke. But if she had had a moment when she'd gotten to, look at someone sardonically and say, "Actually, I was collateral damage because a genocidal prefect wanted to keep an incredibly dangerous animal as a pet in a school," I think she would have had a much different role to play in the books. And I kind of wish she'd had that moment, because that would have, been awesome. Which also made me wonder if anyone ever did tell her that the basilisk was finally dead and whose fault the whole thing actually was. Or after her death, people might have told her that they thought Hagrid did it because Hagrid got blamed. But did they ever actually tell her it wasn't Hagrid's fault after all? I'm assuming that Hagrid probably did not use the, women's bathroom on the second floor or whatever it was very regularly, so he probably didn't run into her all that often. But
I think she did find out. If nothing else, when Harry comes back up, he's defeated the basilisk and she's right there for it.
True. Oh, and he was actually awake for that part. Yes, that's right. Harry in so many of his battles unconscious.
Ends up
I
unconscious.
kind of forget that there are ones where, oh yes, he could have actually talked to someone at that point. Okay.
Yeah. In verse 60, before he dies, Stephen says, "God, do not hold this sin against them," of the people who are stoning him. And that really, to me, felt like Dumbledore, when Dumbledore was about to die, both about Malfoy and about Snape. There's a way in which he's, protecting Malfoy and getting Malfoy to not kill him. But then, even if he had killed him, I think Dumbledore would have still offered that forgiveness or asked for that forgiveness. And then certainly because he had arranged it with Snape, there's no way that Snape killing him should be held against Snape, because that was part of what they had arranged. Our next reading for this Sunday is 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 2 through 10. The author describes God's love as breast milk, and the people of God as newborns and as living stones of God's reign. So one of the main themes for this passage is growth or maturation, becoming more mature. in First Peter, it's growth in faith and maturity. And for Harry and Hermione and Ron, it's more of a like maturation of understanding and compassion for the world and the complexities of it. And so it mostly happens for Harry in Half-Blood Prince and Deathly Hallows, I think, when he finally receives some care and attention for his PTSD and like one-on-one engagement with an adult who cares or appears to care. For Ron, I think he doesn't get there until like the second half of Deathly Hallows when he has like come back from having ditched them. And for Hermione, it's like book 4 when she both figures out like the problematic nature of house elf enslavement and starts to figure out the complexities of it and the complexities of the world and living in a world where truth is not always the thing that is printed in the newspaper and that sort of thing. So I think for her it was book 4, but I'm not as set on when that point was for Hermione as I am on the other two.
Yeah. I had a thought while I was preparing for this episode that I didn't actually manage to attach to any of the individual verses, but, I mean, of course they grow and mature when they get a little special attention, or when they get this one-on-one time. You know, we don't really see Hermione get one-on-one time with a trusted adult as often as Harry and even Ron do, because we don't really see her with her parents. But I think it's natural for people to grow and mature when they get that kind of attention, because it's so life-giving, it's so restoring for them. And I had this wonderful thought of all the careers that we have thought that Harry might want to try when he grows up, wouldn't it be wonderful if he was the person who finally introduced psychology and therapy to the magical world and was a specialist in childhood trauma?
I don't know that he would be great at that, but I think it would be great if he introduced that concept to the magical world.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know that I see him as a counselor or a therapist, but
he seems to be very gentle and very good at teaching with people that he sees as his students or people that he can help. He's less good at doing that with his peers.
Yeah, but he's also like so action-oriented, and so much of therapy and counseling is not action-oriented.
Yeah, he would have to learn patience, and that would take, several decades. But he is a wizard, so his lifespan is already long.
Yeah, but hopefully he'd get the benefits of therapy and start to introduce it from his own perspective as, like, a patient.
I like to think that Hermione would have said, okay, I'm going back to school, but you're not. So guess where you're going when you're off from Aurora training.
Yeah.
In verse 3, we read the author say, "If indeed you have toasted that the Lord is good." And this feels like kind of a weird way to point out that there are people who believe in God but think that either God hates them or God is evil. People like that do exist. This seems like a weird way to acknowledge their existence, but okay. I don't really know what that phrase is doing otherwise. But I do wonder if Snape might be one of those people. Like, if anybody in the Harry Potter books has reason to think that God has it out for them, gracious. I think it would be part of his character.
All right.
If Snape is going to be a theist at all and believe that God exists in the first place, I have to think that he would not think that God had a very good opinion of him.
Yeah. Or he'd at least be pretty suspicious about God.
Yeah.
In verse 5, we hear this exhortation to be like living stones, to let yourselves be built into a spiritual house. Obviously, they're talking about the Hogwarts houses as your spiritual houses. That's just, obvious. Then I was thinking about it more and I was like, actually, the students do constantly rebuild. But the students do constantly rebuild each house. Each time a class leaves and a new class comes, with each new set of students, the house is rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt and built up.
In part, I would think, because each set of students has their own interpretation of what being in their house means.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely part of it, yeah. Just like we each have different interpretations of what it means to be a person of faith or a follower of Christ. Amazing.
Yeah, and continuing on that theme, and my earlier theme of if Harry Potter characters did believe in God, what kind of people would they be? I read in verse 8, they stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. Which is a very Presbyterian moment in the Bible. I am not personally a Presbyterian, but when you read this verse, you can kind of see where they get it. For those who aren't terribly well-versed in the different Christian denominations, Presbyterians are pretty big on God knows what's going to happen. Predestination is a thing, which is not exactly the same thing as God knowing what's going to happen.
Which is Presbyterian and, like, broadly Calvinist.
Yeah, no, I just have gotten used to blaming the Presbyterians for things like that. But and it makes me wonder, is Dumbledore Presbyterian? Because he's such a big fan of prophecies and believes that prophecies are accurate. Is Trelawney Presbyterian?
I definitely think Dumbledore is not, because he talks about, like, the prophecy is only true because people are putting store in it. So that's not predestination type. But Trelawney might be.
Yeah, having met some Presbyterians, Trelawney would make a very interesting one.
Yeah, that'd be hilarious, because, like, a lot of Presbyterian polity, I don't think would resonate for her, but that particular piece of the theology.
Yeah, I've been supply preaching with Presbyterians for the last over a year now, and they are lovely people and I enjoy working with them, but it's a different feel than what I'm used to, and the worship service, the mental image of Trelawney showing up to a Presbyterian worship service is just very enjoyable for me.
That would be hilarious. Although they do, like,
but I am probably, stereotyping Presbyterians based on the ones I've been working with, so...
Probably.
Yeah.
There are some resonances that I'm...
If you are Presbyterian and you would actually love for Trelawney to show up at your worship services, please write us an email. We would love to hear about it.
And in verse 9, we hear that followers of Christ are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. So growing up, like, this always sounded really cool and special, and reading this in light of Harry Potter, the first half of this verse definitely sounds super creepily like purebloods, right? Like, you are chosen and royal and holy and special and set apart. And it's like, well, actually, y'all aren't that special. and part of how this is different is that it's not about lineage. It's about, like, what it means to be people of faith, which is different and not as creepy, and this is only the first half of the verse. The second half of the verse kind of mellows things out a bit, but it just sounded super creepily pureblood to me.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from John chapter 14, verses 1 through 14. Jesus, speaking to the disciples before his death, tells them that he is going to prepare a place for them, and that he is the way, the truth, and the life.
One of the common themes in this particular discourse in John, and this passage in particular, is that the disciples are a little bit slow on the uptake. And that this might be an intentional thing that Jesus does in Jesus' own language to make it harder for them to understand. Right? Like, it takes the disciples a while to get what Jesus is saying. And Jesus is using some kind of convoluted words and phrases and sentences to get there.
Jesus cryptic. No.
I know. It's amazing. But it reminded me of Hermione's Deathly Hallows clue in The Tales of Beedle the Bard that Dumbledore intentionally made really difficult to figure out so that it would take her a while, so that they wouldn't rush things, so that hopefully they would have gotten to the point where they could use the Hallows information without going after the Hallows instead of the Horcruxes.
Yeah.
And then in verse 2, I also just have to note that I love this passage, and this is the gospel reading that we had at my grandmother's funeral, and I picked it out.
For funerals, for a good reason.
I picked it out for different reasons than I think most people did, because my grandfather made miniature mansions, like scale-sized models of mansions in the town they lived in, and so, like, the idea of, like, a big house with many dwelling places was, like, resonating, because my grandmother was the interior decorator the interior designer for all of the miniature mansions. So he would make them, and she would put in all the little people and furniture and stuff. Anyway, so in verse 2, we hear Jesus say, "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you?" Basically, it sounds like Hogwarts, or a scaled-up version of the Burrow, right? Like, the Burrow has many dwelling places. It'd have to be like the Burrow times 100 or something. But, like, the idea of the Burrow would work really well for it, because it's just all of these different rooms and dwelling places and stuff.
I wonder if Bill or Charlie ever told their younger siblings that they were going to Hogwarts to prepare a place for them.
Aww, that's adorable.
I would hope that Bill and Charlie warned Hogwarts about the twins, at least.
Doubtful. And then in verses 5 and 6, Thomas says to Jesus, "We don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" And Jesus is like, "I am the way and the truth and the life." And it reminded me of Half-Blood Prince, the conversation between Harry and Hermione in the movie, where everyone's trying to get Harry to take them to Slughorn's party, and Hermione's like, "They only like you because they think you're the chosen one." And Harry responds and says, "But Hermione, I am the chosen one." And then she whacks him with a book.
Deservedly so. I did love that moment. It
Right.
also reminds me of a story that Tom Holland tells of apparently all through his childhood, one of the ways that his parents would let him know that he was being a little too over-demanding or something like that was to say, "Well, aren't we a movie star?" And then one time his dad said that after he had become, Spider-Man. And Tom looked him straight in the eye and said, "Yes, I am." Apparently they haven't used that since. So.
Nice.
In verse 12, we hear, "The one who believes in me will also do the works that I do." And sometimes Jesus is not terribly cryptic, and this is one of those moments, and I love to celebrate those moments because I feel like I'm encouraging Jesus to be less cryptic. I realize that's not actually going to work, and all this happened 2,000 years ago, but I still like to try. Like, God, if you want to be less cryptic, I am in favor of that. I'm just saying for the record. And as a parallel to the Harry Potter books, for Harry, it did naturally follow that because he was Dumbledore's man, as he put it, he would continue Dumbledore's work. So yes, this is one of those things that just makes sense, and I like to praise God for those moments, because we could use a few more of them.
Praise God for the moments when Jesus makes sense. There's some of them there.
Yeah, possibly. And then in verse 13, Jesus says, "I will do whatever you ask in my name." And this is one of those moments when, maybe possibly Jesus would have wanted to be a little bit more cryptic. Those are much more rare. But I have to say that thank goodness the Weasley twins were not disciples, because that would be a terrible promise to make to them.
That would be hilarious.
Yes, it would. But, oh my goodness, no. So.
Our final Sunday for this episode is the 6th Sunday of Easter, which falls on May 17th this year. Our first reading is Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 31. Paul uses the Athenian altar to an unknown god as a segue to introduce God to a multicultural crowd. This whole passage kind of felt like someone going to the Department of Mysteries and looking at the door, the love door that doesn't even open, and being like, "See that? Here's everything you need to know about love," and just explaining it and ruining the entire mystery. Or not ruining, but explaining away the entire mystery of the thing.
Yeah. When we read verse 24, we hear that God does not live in a shrine made by human hands. While that seems obvious to us, we are less into the idea of gods inhabiting objects than the crowd that Paul was talking to would have been. And I started thinking about this verse and Harry Potter, and I had to ask myself, can you imagine the number of caveats that Paul would have had to put into this sentence if he was speaking to a magical crowd instead of to a muggle crowd? God does not live in a shrine made by human hands, or by magical creature hands, or by paws, or by hoofs. And though, yes, other beings can possess or possibly live in things made by people, though you really shouldn't trust anything if you can't see where it keeps its brain, and so forth.
That would be hilarious. Just
the speech would be 12 times longer. Yeah.
For sure. When I got to verse 26, I was thinking about the ways that God, right, Paul says God allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, and it reminded me of the International Statute of Secrecy and the ways that the International Confederation of Wizards had to set up. This is where you're going to live, and this is how you live, and especially for dragons and stuff, but to set those boundaries so that people would stay secret. Magical people would stay secret. And then in verse 28, Paul quotes Greek poets to the Greek there, and it reminded me, it was just so, I don't know, it felt kind of bizarre and weird for Paul to be like, just like your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. But it reminded me of in the Tales of Beedle the Bard, there's like Dumbledore's commentary afterwards, and frequently Dumbledore quotes like a magical wisdom from the past and like how this story developed to be the story that it is, or like what happened after it, or why certain people didn't like it or whatever. And it's frequently quoting like someone with the last name of Malfoy to prove points, mostly about how bad anti-Muggle sentiments are, and therefore why there was pushback against a particular story where Muggles are treated well, or there's affinity for Muggles.
Yeah. And then in verse 29, we hear, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. And part of the reason why Paul is saying that is because the limits of our imagination will naturally put limits on God that God does not have, if we try to understand God that way. And that made me think of the many times that lack of imagination stifles things in the magical world. I mean, there are several times when we see Muggleborns, specifically Harry, I think also maybe Hermione, they discover things that they had never imagined in the magical world, that's part of it, but also, like, the magical world stifles itself by their lack of imagination, by not incorporating some Muggle ideas. That would have been awfully useful.
Mm-hmm. How long did it take for them to get indoor plumbing?
Yeah, you have to wonder. One of my favorite fanfictions pointed out that they would have probably really liked the idea of mechanical pencils, or like pencils at all in the magical world. Those are useful.
Mm-hmm.
And various biases and prejudices that they have. And, then if you want to take a step back, there's also the idea of how many times was the magical world of Harry Potter stifled because of Ms. Rowling's lack of imagination?
A lot.
Yes, so.
For sure. Yeah, interesting. I think notebooks would have been a key thing, because scrolls get smushed.
Yeah.
So easily.
We don't have the imagination to come up with how powerful or how extraordinary God is. And I think our limits in imagining the magical world is a good parallel for that. Our next reading for this Sunday is from 1 Peter, chapter 3, verses 13 through 22. The author encourages us to act with gentleness and reverence when faced with persecution for doing good.
So in this passage, the author talks again about suffering with purpose, and I was thinking about it, and theoretically, this is what Sirius is doing in the vision that Voldemort plants in Harry's head at the end of Order of the Phoenix. The thing that terrifies Harry is that Sirius is suffering, but like the way that Sirius is suffering and the reason Sirius is suffering is like a righteous thing. And so that would work, except it's not actually real. And it would be something that Sirius would do, I think, but again, not actually real. But Mr. Weasley's suffering from the snake bite, minus the soiree into Muggle medicine, is a great example of this, because he's doing it because of his work for the Order. And there's actually like this really intense conversation between Sirius and the Weasley kids when they want to go show up at St. Mungo's, and Sirius is like, you can't. There's no explanation for why you would know so fast what is going on. And they, don't get it and are not okay with it. But ultimately, Sirius is like, this is what it means to be in the Order. This is why you're not in the Order, because you don't get this. It matters this much.
And by waiting, they are actually suffering with purpose, for that matter.
Yeah.
In verse 13, the author says, "Now who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good?" Well, I don't know if you want this list to be alphabetical or categorical or what, but we've got Voldemort, we've got Death Eaters, we've got possibly the Ministry, we've definitely got Umbridge, and there's a whole other list of people that probably will want to harm you if you are eager to do what is good. Congratulations, have a great day.
Yeah, just kind of a lot of people. That's all. No big deal.
Every so often the Bible sounds sadly naive, and this is one of those moments.
Yep, for sure. Well, and in verse 15, there's the exhortation to always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Harry definitely had to do this to, give an accounting for his trust in Dumbledore and for the hope that he could actually defeat Voldemort. But I also think, part of it is, again, in Order of the Phoenix, when he just has this, hope and this determination that mostly comes from Dumbledore's army, but like there are places and moments where Harry really does have that deep hope that doesn't always make sense or can't always be easily explained.
And for that matter, Neville and Luna both show that same thing too, especially Luna.
Yeah, Luna's great at it. And then in verse 20, we hear about when God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were saved through the water. You know, to be way specific about a thing that is not a historical fact. But
the Wizarding World would never do that.
Never. I was actually thinking about how much the Order would have felt like Noah's family in the fight against Voldemort. Like, it's just such a lonely thing, especially at the beginning when it's them literally against everyone because of the way that Fudge is in denial. But just this, like, small group trying to survive and trying to, like, not be overcome by evil.
And only having each other to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And often enough being cooped up together because they literally couldn't go anywhere because they were in it. Oh, look. It's almost like they were in quarantine together.
Oh, gosh.
And then in verse 21, we hear that baptism now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body. Well, yes, okay, that is true, thank you, author of 1 Peter, but I would like to point out that this does not mean that personal hygiene is not important. Personal hygiene still matters, even if you don't have a prefix bathroom.
Truth.
As awesome as that would be, and as much more fun as life would be if you did have one. Please wash your hands.
And then wash them again.
Yes, and also other parts of your body.
Mm-hmm. All the parts.
Hygiene is good. Like, yeah, the Bible is not giving you an excuse to not bathe, and neither is Harry Potter.
Truth. It is, however, telling you that a baptism is not the same as a bath.
Yes, if you get baptized, that's great. We are very happy for you. Please still wash your hands.
You still have to take a shower.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is John chapter 14, verses 15 through 21. The night before his death, Jesus tells the disciples he is sending the Holy Spirit to them. So one of the themes that comes up really strongly in this particular passage is love and the mutual upbuilding of love, so that the one you love, I also love kind of thing that Jesus has going on with, like, God and Jesus and the disciples. The flip side of this, of course, being the one who harms the one I love harms me, which is how Molly interprets the report about Hermione from Rita Skeeter, which of course is a complete lie. Molly doesn't know that because she's reading a newspaper, and newspapers are, well, actually it's a magazine, so she should probably know better. Well, because it's not just like...
about information literacy in the magical world. Oh, wait, no, that sounds like a horrible conversation.
Yeah, there is no information literacy in the magical world. It's a, like, magazine that deals with gossip.
Yeah.
So Molly should maybe know better. And there is, like, this deep and profound love for Harry that comes out when she sends Hermione this, like, teeny tiny Easter egg that, like, and is, like, cold to her before the third task. Because she thinks that Hermione has been playing games with Harry and she loves Harry that much.
I would have liked to actually have seen some of Hermione's personal reaction to all that, because we didn't really get to see what she thought of it. We got to see Harry's reaction, but...
No, we got Hermione. To what?
To the tiny Easter egg. And
yeah, we got that in the books.
Okay, maybe I'll have to go back and reread that one.
Yeah,
it has been a while since I've reread 4.
Hermione gets really disappointed and, like, tries to bring it up, and everybody's like, never mind. Like, no, that's not.
Well, that's not helpful. Okay.
And then when Molly's there for the third task and is, like, cold to Hermione, then Harry's like, Hermione kind of deflates. And then Harry's like, Mrs. Weasley, you know that thing is not true, right? And then Molly's back to... In verse 16, Jesus says, "And I will ask the Father who will give you another advocate to be with you forever." God is promising a Professor Dumbledore to take on all your Wizengamots.
And Dumbledore's actually pretty good at that, so... Yeah.
I know. That's, like, actually a thing he could do. Maybe he should have been a defense attorney instead of headmaster.
That could have been fun.
I think that would have been it definitely would have been a different career path for him, but that could have actually been...
suited him properly.
Mm-hmm.
Also, he would have gotten to have been, as completely partial to Gryffindors as he wanted, without causing anyone any problems.
I mean, right now he's pretty partial to Ravenclaws in my game because I'm a Ravenclaw. So,
yeah. Well, I kind of may have dumped on Dumbledore a bit there because I was planning on doing so with my next verse, which is verse 18. Verse 18 has Jesus telling the disciples, "I will not leave you orphaned." I have particular warm and fuzzy feelings towards this verse because 3 years ago, the last time it came up in the lectionary, I confirmed a child that day had been adopted from foster care. And that was an extraordinary pairing of lectionary and real life. I love it when that happens. So I have very warm and fuzzy feelings towards this verse, and it's a fairly warm and fuzzy verse because, Jesus is saying, "I will not leave you orphaned," and that's lovely. And then I asked myself, how does this connect to Harry Potter? And my immediate thought was, although Dumbledore will totally abandon you to abusive relatives who lie to you about your parents, because doing some research to see whether or not you have any other living blood relatives who would still protect you by your mom's death magic would be too much work, and also not allow him the dramatic moment of leaving a baby on the stoop with the note to be found hours later, because that's a great way to go about infant care. So I might, have reacted a little strongly to that one.
Yeah. Well, and I read it and was like, "I will not leave you orphaned. I'm coming to you." How would that promise have impacted Tom Riddle, right? Like, 1-year-old Tom Riddle.
Or even if 11-year-old Tom Riddle, one of the professors had said, "You know what, your life in the orphanage there just sucks. Why don't you come home with me for the summer?" Or something like that. Not even necessarily full-on adopting him, but saying, "We won't leave you to this."
Or like somebody else's family, right? Like they adopt Harry.
Yeah. If someone had said, "Why don't you come home with me for the summer?" Voldemort might not have happened.
Yeah. But I think even just like before he discovers Hogwarts, right? Like this promise that there is another option, that like this isn't his destiny, that he's not stuck in the orphanage. And I think that's like, I wonder how that would have impacted his development, and if he, knowing he was not alone, knowing he was not stuck, if he would have been a better person.
Yeah. Well, and when preaching this verse, it is important to remember that some people are like Tom Riddle. Some people are left in orphanages or are not adopted from foster care or that kind of thing. And when we talk about Jesus not leaving people orphaned, we have to address that there are actual orphans in the world, and it's important to acknowledge their existence too. And then finally in verse 19, we hear, "In a little while the world will no longer see me." And of course, we don't have proof that Jesus didn't have an invisibility cloak. He might have. That's an option. Actually, I suppose, come to think of it, if anybody was going to have that particular deathly hollow while Jesus was on Earth, that would make sense. I really hope the resurrection stone wasn't involved. That would throw a kind of gigantic...
I was just gonna say that.
Yeah, wrench into Christian theology in general.
Just a little.
Actually, I think we had that conversation for our Easter episode.
Probably.
But, yeah, no, I think Jesus is actually talking about his death here, and not necessarily just, flipping a cloak over him and running away. So, as much fun as that might have been. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for Ascension Day, the 7th Sunday of Easter, and Pentecost.
This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, HP at Church, or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.